The Master Chief during the Zeta Halo campaign in 2560 is 49 years of age. For a man pushing his 50s, he's still operating at inhuman levels of physical prowess and is still kicking ass and taking names. And of course, as we well know, Spartans just don't age the same as normal human beings. But of course, the Master Chief isn't the only character that we've played as who's still alive. Thel Vadam, the Arbiter, was born in 2485 and is still alive at the same time the Chief is, making him 75 years old. Yet, even characters who are no longer with us still lived to a grand old age. Sergeant Johnson, for example, in the year that he died, in 2552, was 78 years old. And he looked damn good for his age. But it got me thinking, what kind of ages are we talking about for other humans, other species in the Halo universe? And that's what inspired this entire video, and the last three may or may not surprise you. Roll the intro. Hey everyone, welcome back to Installation 00, and today we're talking about the ages of different characters in the Halo universe and figuring out just how old they got, and the oldest beings in the universe. But let's set down some ground rules first. If they're artificial intelligences, ancillars, or synthetic organisms, they don't count, because they weren't quote-unquote living in the conventional sense in the first place. If they are or were once living as a biological organism, and then they were turned into an ancillar or an AI, they do count. And we'll even consider a single consciousness that has lived in multiple organic instances to be included in that list as well. So our first stop off is with Let Volir, a Sangheili mercenary in employment with the Banished. He fought alongside Aatrox at the Ark against the Spirit of Fire in 2559. And as far as we're aware, he's still alive. Meaning in 2559, he's 82 years old. But let's go a little bit more recent as far as game narrative is concerned. Bassus, the brute chieftain that the Master Chief killed at the excavation site on Zeta Halo, died at the age of 85. Escharum, Aatrox's friend and mentor, died at the hands of the Master Chief at the age of 89. Yes, admittedly, so far, many of these names have been the names of other species. So let's bring it back to home. Admiral Preston Cole. He was born November the 3rd, 2470, and was officially listed as killed in action on April 18th of 2543 at the age of 72. This was following his apparent death at Psi Serpentis, where he plunged the UNSC Everest deep into the immense gravity well of a gas giant and then fired all of his nuclear missiles towards the centre of the planet, causing the planet to ignite into a brown dwarf. It was assumed he died at this point. However, in 2552, an Oni operative by the codename of Surgeon stated that two AIs, AI Phoenix and AI Lackluster, had analysed the footage from the battle and had calculated that there was approximately an 89.7% chance that Cole actually survived and escaped in an emergency slip-space jump. Barring the possibility that he passed away of natural causes at some point between then and now, if he is still alive in 2560, he will be 90 years old. Beating him by only a single year is Lod Mron, otherwise known as the Prophet of Regret, who died in 2552 at the hands of the Master Chief at the age of 91. Tobias Shaw, one of the co-creators of the Shaw Fujikawa translate engine that allowed humanity to access the deep depths of space via slip-space transit, died in 2317 at the age of 97. A grand old age to be sure, but is surpassed by retired Commander-in-Chief of the Office of Naval Intelligence, Admiral Margaret Parangosky, whom, as far as we know, is still living in 2560 at the age of 99. But ages of under a century aren't unusual for humans. It's when it crosses over to beyond a century that things start to get interesting. Such as the case of Dr. Andrew Sandmore, whom is in attendance on the UNSC's Spirit of Fire. At least he's not been confirmed as being killed in action during any of the activities that the Spirit of Fire has seen. So, assuming he's still alive in 2560, he was born in 2459, making him 101 years old. The other half of the creators of the Shaw Fujikawa translate engine, being that of Wallace Fujikawa, died in 2318 at the age of 102. And the next two, we have to go to an Oni black site. We have to go to, I assume, Midnight Facility. Now this first one is tenuous at best, but I thought worth mentioning. Many of you will remember the name Colonel Robert Watts. Colonel Robert Watts was a rebel leader who was captured and brought back to the UNSC by the Spartan IIs led by John 117 before they were given their Mjolnir-powered assault armour. Upon his return to UNSC-controlled space, Oni imprisoned him and interrogated him. The eerie thing is that there have been no confirmations as to whether or not he has died, presenting at least the slim possibility that he is still alive in 2560. And if this is the case, that would make him 105 years old. And next we have the occupant of Cell 56, being that of Alo Sebukah, a Sansharum politician who has been captured by the Office of Naval Intelligence and interrogated as recently as January 15th of 2553. Again, there are no confirmations as to whether or not this particular individual has died, leading to the possibility that if they are still alive in 2560, they would be 106 years old. Ages of over 100 years old, and in truth much older, are relatively commonplace for the Sansharum, so keeping with that theme, let's now look at Ord Casto, otherwise known as the Prophet of Truth, who died in 2552 at the hands of Thelvadam at the age of 156. Wind the clocks back to the formation of the Covenant, and we have two more Sansharum to draw example from, one being that of Soperada'Makra, otherwise known as Breaking Shadow, who was born in 1018 BCE, and the last records of him were in 852 BCE, making him 166, and the second being Ekla'Maga'Sadow, otherwise known as Pervading Stone, born in 1041 and died in 855 BCE, giving him a grand old age of 186. But there is one Sansharum that can do better than that again, and that is the Sansharum known as Hod Rumnt, or more recognisably, the Prophet of Mercy, who again died in 2552 to the Flood at the age of 220. Surely now we're getting to a point where we're going to cross over into the Foreigners, and their ages are ridiculous, but there's one last curveball before we take that leap, and it comes in the form of Colony, a Lekgolo Gestalt hunter pair, who were born in 2310 and are still alive in 2559, making them 250 years old, a quarter of a millennium. Even I was surprised by that one. But of course, now we're dealing with ridiculous numbers. Now we're dealing with the Foreigners, whose lifespans were humongous. And we start with the Master Builder Faber, who was born in 110,962 BCE and died in 97,445 BCE at the firing of the Halos at the age of 13,517 years old. And that's one of the youngest Foreigners on our list today. The next being the Librarian, who was born in 112,329 BCE and died again at the firing of the Halo Array in 97,445 BCE at the age of 14,884. However, I will put a caveat here to state that 343 Guilty Spark, now only known as Spark, occupying a Foreigner Harbinger platform, went seeking an imprint of the Librarian buried under Mount Kilimanjaro in the plains of Africa, believing her to still be alive, and in one sense or another, she kind of was. However, as an essence, she is isolated to the systems that she occupies. However, Spark goes on to say that she should walk with the living again in a Forerunner Armiger like he does, and she declines, stating it isn't time yet, suggesting perhaps that at some point in the future she may do just that, and if she did do that, in 2560, that would make her 114,887 years old. But until that's either confirmed or denied, we're sticking with the 14,884. Next, we're bringing the Forerunner technology to bear, and looking at an individual whom has stood the test of time and lived in the most recent era, but is not a Forerunner. The Harbinger, a member of the Xananin, was born at an unknown time and imprisoned very shortly after the firing of the Halo Array in 97,368 BCE. We don't know how old she was when she was imprisoned. However, she was awoken from her Silix in 2560 on Zeta Halo, making her 99,928 years old as of the date she was imprisoned. Add to that her biological age, we just don't know that at the moment. Still a point of immense frustration. The ancient human known as Chakas, who would eventually be composed and become 343 Guilty Spark. Chakas was born in an unknown year. He was, however, composed in 97,452 BCE and is still alive in 2560, occupying a Forerunner Armiger platform, which makes him 100,012 years old. And before we tackle the top three, we finally have the Didact, who was born in 110,225 BCE and was digitized in 2557, which makes him 112,782 years old, and his story isn't quite over yet. However, as a digitized essence, I wouldn't consider that as being living, as he is bound by the system in which he exists. And before we hit the top three, just some honourable mentions: mendicant bias and offensive bias. The reality of these are we just don't know exactly how old they are due to no information on their compound mind's origins. Obviously, if they were entirely synthetic, they cannot be included on this list. However, if the original minds were organic, there is no information about them, thereby meaning we don't know how old they are. The Lord of Admirals, 4th Hencho, was born in an unknown year, but we do know when he died, and he died in 106,445. He was composed immediately following 1,000 years of a siege on Charam Hakor, 56 of which was spent within the citadel on Charam Hakor fighting back the Didact's forces. Why is he on the list? Well, because he was composed and then re-emerged several thousand years later within the mind of Chakas, the ancient human, who was then composed and became 343 Guilty Spark, and whom still carries the imprint of 4th Hencho. So by definition, 4th Hencho is alive and quote-unquote well within the mind of Spark, moving around in a Forerunner Armiger, meaning he would be 110,061 years old. However, I don't include him on this list, because I don't know the compounding effects of a composed mind imprint being composed again and turned into a monitor. I don't know if those multiple levels of composition leads to really a full expression of consciousness. And one last honourable mention being that of all Hurugok. Every single last one of them. In theory, they could live indefinite lifespans. They are not included on this list because they aren't technically biological entities. They are synthetic organisms. They were originally created by the Forerunners and thus cannot be considered as being quote-unquote alive. And now we move on to our top three. And in third place we have Splendid Dust of Ancient Suns. a foreigner politician who was composed and turned into 000 Tragic Solitude, the monitor of the Ark. He was born in 111,209 BCE, lived through the firing of the arrays and was present at the rebooting of the domain. He chose to be composed to atone for the foreigner's many sins, and took up the mantle as Tragic Solitude, whom lived right the way up until 2555, where he was killed by Bobby Kodiak at the age of 113,764. In second place, unsurprisingly, is the Primordial, or more accurately, the Gravemind, as the Primordial was the first Gravemind and the last Precursor. It was said that the Primordial arrived on the edges of the galaxy 9.1 million years ago, and due to flood supercell biology and neural physics, the consciousness of the Primordial, the first Gravemind, continues to exist in perpetuity as long as the flood exists, and is expressed when a flood infestation reaches the coordinated phase and a proto-Gravemind turns into an actual Gravemind. The same singular consciousness re-emerges once more. This means, since the Gravemind, or rather the flood in general, still exist in 2560, the Gravemind is at least 9.1 million years old. And in first place, somewhat unsurprisingly, are the Precursors. The Precursors were thought to have been killed into extinction by the foreigners, and the dust that some of them reduced themselves into, that then regrew and became corrupted and turned into the flood, were a different entity altogether, meaning that all traces of the Precursors died when the flood emerged. This has since been proven to be untrue in relatively recent book releases, particularly in Point of Light and Outcasts, both of which highlight moments of interaction between certain characters and the Precursors, meaning the Precursors are still alive in one form or another. We don't truly know how old the Precursors are. All we do know is that they existed around 10 million years ago, when the foreigners, being dissatisfied of being passed over for holding the mantle, rebelled against them, meaning the Precursors are still alive, and thus well over 10 million years old. But I'm not entirely satisfied with that. I'm going to give you one more esoteric bonus for good measure. The domain. The domain is a repository, a data repository, composed of the combined information of countless lives. It's a huge neural physical database. But it also has a will of its own, which suggests an active consciousness therein. And since neural physics can be considered a form of living time and living space, the domain, in one way or another, can be considered as being alive. It was damaged but rebooted 100 years after the Halo Array fired by the design seed of growth through trial of change, which means at the absolute bare minimum, her consciousness resides somewhere therein. But again, the domain expresses a will of its own, and if we can consider the domain to be a living entity, it has been said on record that the domain contains 100 billion years of archives, which means the oldest entity in the Halo universe is older than the universe it occupies. I'll leave that thought to stew for a while, and until next time. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, consider smashing the like button and leave a comment below on what you'd like me to cover next. Big shout out to my patrons, Spartan10148, the Metarch of my installation, Falcon, Prophet Bear, Mikhail, Sophia, and Ashley, my dutiful monitors, Darian, Scarab, Spartan0137, Anthony, Ghost, Aaron, Chris, Jacob, Sean, Element Zero, Somatic, Jordan J3, Dan, Mr. Keys, Directal, Gunslinger, Jacob, Bandmill, Echo, Evermore, Officer Cat, and Personal Devil, my diligent sub-monitors, my fleet of Strato Sentinels, and my loyal enforcers. and all the other patrons who have jumped aboard to support the channel. It means more to me than I can accurately put into words. Another shout out to my Tier 0 Transcendent YouTube members, Spartan137, Jacob, Schmitty, Talia, Fenrir and Born Stella, and all the other YouTube members keeping my installation running on that glorious vacuum energy. Shout out to John for I don't fucking know. And if you want more of this kind of content, hit the subscribe button and the little bell icon so you don't miss any future videos, and consider jumping aboard yourself as a patron or YouTube member to keep the channel alive and kicking. Thanks again for watching, take it easy everyone, and find peace in the domain.